Open the doors of your mind. Escape the noise of today, the lights of the cities, and the speed of time. Now we are 15,000 years ago, in an age when the world was still very young, very white, and very silent. Close your eyes and imagine. Hear the sound of fresh snow crunching under your feet. Before you stretches an endless sea of ice. This is Beringia, a massive land bridge now underwater that once connected Asia and America. The sky is illuminated by the green and purple dance of the aurora borealis. The air is so cold that every breath you take feels like a sharp crystal in your chest. A small group of people, bent against the wind, are moving forward with heavy steps. They are the greatest explorers in history. But they don't see themselves as explorers. They are just a family, a community, struggling to survive. They wear thick mammoth furs and carry spears carved from bone. The Siberian steppes they left behind are now far away. Before them lay a new world shrouded in mist, a world of unknown nature. These people are a part of nature. They understand the language of the wind, and they navigate by the position of the stars. For them, this journey is not a conquest, but an ancient pursuit. Enormous herds advance before them, woolly mammoths, ancient bison, and wild horses. These animals are both their sustenance and their guides. Wherever the animals go, there is life.
They glide through a narrow passage called the Ice-Free Corridor between the massive walls of the Ice Age. On their right are thousands of meters high azure icebergs, and on their left a stormy sea. Their steps are heavy but determined. A baby on its mother's back sleeps in the warmth of the fur. That baby is a representative of the first generation to grow up on a new continent. Slowly, the landscape begins to change. The endless whiteness gives way to stunted bushes, frozen lakes, and finally, green pine forests appearing in the distance. The earth is now softer, the air somewhat calmer. They are stepping onto a continent untouched, unspoiled, and unpolluted for thousands of years. North America greets them in all its glory. This silent migration is not merely a displacement, it is the beginning of one of the greatest epics in human history. These people brought with them not only their sharp stone tools, but also their stories, their beliefs, and their deep respect for nature. The civilizations they would build in these new lands, the towering mounds, the cities carved into the cliffs, and the confederations governed by laws of peace were shaped by these first steps taken on this snowy path. Now listen to the sound of the wind. It carries the whispers of those who walked this path thousands of years ago. They were here. They walked. And they became the first spirit of this vast continent. Your eyes are growing heavy. Rest peacefully in that ancient land where the ice melts, the rivers flow exuberantly, and the first fire is lit. Tomorrow, we will awaken to that old world, the Paleo-Native American era, where mammoth hunters and giant creatures reigned.
In the final days of the Ice Age, the heart of North America beat with a balance of ferocity and grace beyond the comprehension of modern man. Around 13,000 BC, the first master hunters, whom we now call the Clovis culture, were not only surviving, but also playing a relentless game of chess with nature. The sky was as clear as pristine glass, and the stars 10 times brighter than they are today. Every step these people took was etched into the earth, groaning beneath the massive ice floes. For them, the world was not just a landscape, but a living organism where death or life lurked behind every bush. Their focal point was the woolly mammoth, one of the largest land mammals the world has ever seen. Imagine a 10-ton giant slowly emerging from the ice and fog, its vapor rising from its lungs like a cloud suspended in the air. To face these giants, the Clovis hunters crafted flint with the precision of a jeweler. The symmetrical, double-edged, grooved spearheads we call Clovis tips were the first great triumph of human ingenuity over physical force in nature. Imagine a hunting scene. Complete silence reigns. They glide silently behind the herd, through knee-deep snow so as not to betray their scent by the wind. A young hunter grips his atlatl, a spear-throwing device that greatly increases the spear's range and piercing power. His heart races beneath his leather clothing, but his hands are ice-cold and determined. At a signal from the leader, the spears soar through the air. This is not just a hunt, it is a sacred ritual that determines whether a community will survive the winter, whether the children will grow up. When the giant mammoth felled, this mountain-like mass meant life for the entire tribe. Tent frames were made from its bones, art objects from its ivory, and storm-proof shelters from its fur. The people of that era possessed a wisdom that allowed them to apologize to the spirit of the creature they killed, to feel gratitude towards it, and to always leave something behind in the earth. However, as the climate warmed and the vast glaciers melted, transforming into vast lakes, the megafauna, these giant animals, began to disappear one by one. It wasn't just the climate that changed. Humanity, on the cusp of this great transformation, was preparing for a new phase where it would turn to smaller but more agile prey, begin to decipher the language of plants, and embark on a great migration that would color every corner of America. These first tales of heroism, told around the campfire, became ingrained in the continent's genetic makeup as courage and adaptability. As the ice retreated, the American continent stretched before humanity like a vast, untouched promised land. There was no longer a single route. The descendants of those first pioneers began to seep into the continent's veins like a river branching off. This period witnessed one of history's greatest and quietest conquests. Groups separated, each seeking a new sky, a new river. Some descended south, following the misty and turbulent Pacific coast of the West. There they breathed in the scent of vast redwood forests, discovered the bounty brought by the ocean's mighty waves, whales and schools of salmon. Others ventured east into the endless green sea we now call the woodlands.
In those vast forests, untouched by axe blows where trees covered the sky, every rustling leaf heralded a new adventure. This expansion was not merely a geographical movement, but also a tremendous cultural diversification. Each stop, each settlement reshaped humanity. The differences between those living on the rugged slopes of the Appalachian Mountains and those settling on the fertile plains of the Mississippi River began to deepen. Dialects changed, clothing styles adapted to the climate, and stone carving techniques varied according to local minds. These people learned to read every corner of the continent like a library. They knew which fruit healed, which root was poisonous, and which wind brought storms. From the peaks of the Rocky Mountains to the vast grasslands of the Great Plains, human traces began to appear in every inch of land. The red ochre figures drawn on cave walls were like deeds to the paths they had traveled. During this period, America transformed from a mere settlement into a homeland. This deep connection with the land led each tribe to create its own creation myth. Some believed they sprang from the earth like an ear of corn, while others believed they descended from the sky on the wings of an eagle. Every stop along the migration routes was the foundation of the great cities and confederations that would be established thousands of years later.
Humankind was no longer merely exploring this vast continent. It was becoming a part of it, breathing its air. This massive expansion was written in golden letters on the silent pages of history as one of the most brilliant periods of human ingenuity and resilience in the wilderness.
At the end of millennia of interaction with nature, the silent revolution that would forever change human history took place. The secret of the seed was unlocked. Around 3000 BC, a miracle spreading north from what is now Mexico radically disrupted the rhythm of life for the indigenous people. This miracle was called corn. But this was far different from modern agriculture as we know it. It was almost a spiritual partnership. Indigenous peoples developed the Three Sisters agricultural system, uniting the balance of nature in a single pit. Imagine, when the first rays of the sun fall on the fields, corn, beans, and squash grow together, intertwined. Corn was the eldest of the family. Its strong and proud trunk reached towards the sky, providing a solid support for the beans to climb. The beans, like a grateful sibling, clung to the corn's trunk, pumping nitrogen into the soil in return for the corn's survival. The youngest sibling, the squash, spread its broad, hairy leaves like a blanket over the soil. This green armor protected the soil from the sun's moisture, prevented weed growth, and its thorny structure warded off harmful animals. This trio was not only a biological miracle, but also the engine of social change. People no longer had to chase after prey. A connection to the land brought settled life, and consequently, property, storage containers, and more complex social structures. Villages grew, populations increased, and the fear of winter gave way to peaceful anticipation as granaries filled. Thanks to this agricultural genius, people began to celebrate the cycle of seasons with hymns and dances. Harvest time was no longer just a workday, but a sacred festival of gratitude to the land. Each kernel of corn was a life, each bean sprout a hope. This system was the most concrete evidence of the sustainable relationship that Native Americans established with their environment. They wasted nothing, did not exhaust the soil, but rather nourished it and reaped its rewards. This nutritional revolution not only increased their physical strength, but also provided the energy needed for the great civilizations that would later flourish in architecture, astronomy, and art. The blessing of the Three Sisters resonated throughout America, from its forests to its deserts, and permanently changed the spirit of the continent. Imagine thousands of sandstone blocks hand-carried into natural cavities in steep cliffs hundreds of meters high. Mud and straw were used as mortar. The resulting structures resemble a fortress from the outside and a giant beehive from the inside. These cities were not merely shelters, each was a massive observatory precisely aligned with the movements of the sun and moon. At the winter equinox, sunlight streamed through the perfect window, falling upon a sacred symbol. It was a perfect synchronization with the sky. Women crafted their unique pottery, reflecting the geometric dance of black and white, while men prayed for rain on the cliffside plains to cultivate corn. But around 1300 AD, something began to go wrong in these magnificent cities. The sky stopped raining, the earth turned sour. Decades of great drought forced the Anasazi to make the most difficult decision. They left their cities, their belongings, and their memories behind, and silently migrated south to the lands now inhabited by the Hopi and Zuni peoples. The ghost towns they left behind still seem to whisper the songs of their former inhabitants when the wind blows. Why did they leave? What exactly happened? The answer to these questions lies hidden in the silent stones of those abandoned cliff dwellings. They did not disappear, they merely changed form. Their engineering genius and delicate balance with nature continue to silently teach a lesson to the modern world.
These stone palaces rising in the middle of the desert are timeless proof of how humans can create elegance and civilization even in the most challenging conditions.
Completely escape the noise of the modern world and travel back to the mid-1000s AD to the Mississippi Plains directly opposite present-day St. Louis. Before you rises a colossal metropolis, even more populous than London at the time, considered the heart of North America, Cahokia. This is not just a settlement, but the most magnificent example of how human hands can transform Earth into a mountain. At the center of the city stands a massive structure defying the sky, Monk's Mound. This is a gigantic earthen pyramid built from hundreds of millions of pounds of earth carried in baskets by thousands of people, its base even wider than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. At this highest point of the city sat the supreme leader, considered the son of the sun, watching over the tens of thousands of people toiling like ants below. Cahokia's population reached 40,000 at that time, a figure unattainable in North America until the 18th century. The city was built with impeccable astronomical precision. The enormous wooden pillars, known as Woodhenge, followed the sunrise and the changing seasons like a calendar. In the city's vast squares, games called chunky, where stones were thrown, were played, watched with excitement by thousands. It was a paradise of commerce. Seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from Canada, and mica from the Great Lakes changed hands here.
In the mornings, the mist rising over the river mingled with the smoke from thousands of thatched houses. The social hierarchy was so pronounced that nobles lived in the highest mounds, while commoners tended the cornfields on the plains below. But this enormous city was not only a place of grandeur, but also a place of the hardships brought about by overpopulation. The depletion of resources, deforestation, and pollution of the rivers began to gnaw away at this vast organism from within. By 1350 AD, Cahokia was slowly fading into silence. People had left the city, the wooden walls had rotted, but those massive earthen pyramids are still there, defying the damp winds of the Mississippi for millennia. Cahokia is America's forgotten golden age, a sad and glorious story of an empire buried beneath the earth. Imagine walking the streets of this vast city, feeling the energy of its crowds. This was the first true capital of the American continent. Cahokia was a center, but Mississippi culture was a vast network of civilization that encompassed all of southeastern America. These peoples adorned the American East with massive works of art, mounds, using the land as a sacred canvas. This wasn't simply digging holes or piling up earth. It was an effort to reconstruct the cosmos on Earth. As you approached a Mississippi settlement, these artificial mountains rising on the horizon whispered to you the power of the community. Some mounds were cone-shaped, others flat-topped pyramids, and atop them were magnificent wooden temples. The most striking aspect of this culture was its incredibly sophisticated social hierarchy. The ruling class, called the Sun, possessed godlike authority. When they died, their most precious possessions were buried with them. Finely crafted copper plates, mica masks, and the rarest pieces of the ocean. Mississippi artists brought stones and bones to life. They were united around a belief system called the Southeast Ceremonial Complex. In this system, birdmen, horned snakes, and sun discs were the most common symbols. During rituals, smoke rose, drums echoed along the riverbank, and the community danced to maintain the balance of the universe. For them, the land was not merely a material, but a living entity. Agriculture was so advanced that every flood of the Mississippi River brought new life to the fields. Women fed the community by processing corn and squash, while men were both skilled hunters and merchants who traveled the river routes. Thousands of kilometers were covered by canoes, carrying news and goods from one end of the continent to the other. But this civilization also had a dark side. Wars and conflicts were inevitable. Cities were protected by walls surrounded by massive wooden stilts. Mississippi culture was at its peak just before the arrival of Europeans, but even when it began to disintegrate due to internal reasons, the massive mounds it left behind remained like indelible signatures. Today, when you stand on these mounds, you feel the remnants of a hierarchy, a religion, and a way of life thousands of years old beneath your feet. They are the greatest poems ever written on the earth. Now let's leave the riverbanks and go to the quiet, red, and desolate canyons of New Mexico. Chaco Canyon is one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world of America. Here, the people who lived between 850 and 1150 AD built not just buildings, but a gigantic astronomical machine. Pueblo Bonito, the most magnificent of the great houses, called Great Houses, had hundreds of rooms and was the largest building complex in America at that time. The Chaco people carved stone so perfectly that they could build walls without mortar. But what makes this place truly miraculous is the arrangement of these buildings. Each structure was aligned with millimeter precision according to the movements of the moon and the sun. They knew exactly where the sun would rise at the equinoxes and how the moon would complete its 18.6-year cycle thousands of years in advance. Chaco was more of a massive ceremonial center than a place of habitation. They built hundreds of miles of straight roads leading into the canyon. These paths never deviated from the rugged terrain, crossing mountains and descending cliffs. Along these paths, thousands of pilgrims from surrounding regions brought offerings and exotic birds to Chaco. Parrot feathers and cocoa brought from Central America prove how vast a network this desert center was a part of. At night, fires burning in the canyon shone as brightly as the stars. But Chaco's end was as mysterious as its beginning. After a great drought or a religious change, these massive stone cities were suddenly abandoned. The doors were sealed, the rooms cleaned, and the people departed as if they would never return. The sun dagger on the Fajada Butte they left behind still shines its light through the rock crevices at every equinox, landing right in its center. Chaco Canyon is a story of humanity's deep connection with the universe, its obsession with the sky, and the cold yet magnificent aesthetic created in the middle of the desert. As you walk among those silent walls, you can still hear the echoes of ancient hymns. Returning to the vast forests of the Northeast, to the lands that today encompass New York State and its surroundings, we encounter one of the most advanced political geniuses in human history, the Five Nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. After centuries of bloody warfare, these tribes established one of the earliest examples of peace and democracy. Legend has it that Hiawatha and peace envoy Deganawida united the tribes and proclaimed the Guyana-Shagoa, or Great Act of Peace. This was a system that would even inspire the modern United States Constitution. The foundation of the Confederation was a vast assembly where every individual was represented and decisions were made by consensus. But the most striking aspect of this system is the role given to women. In Iroquois society, women, especially clan mothers, had the power to choose leaders, declare war, or make peace. Lineage passed through the mother, not the father. Property belonged to women. This was a level of freedom and balance unimaginable for the world at that time. Gathered under the shade of the white pine, these nations buried all their weapons beneath it, vowing never to wage war against each other again. The Iroquois were not only a military force, but also a cultural fortress. Living in enormous longhouses, these families practiced a sharing economy. Everyone's needs were met. No one went hungry. Belts made of seashells, called wampum, served both as currency and a sacred archive recording historical events. The Confederation developed such powerful diplomacy and strategy that when Europeans arrived, they found not only ferocious warriors, but also a multilingual and sophisticated state structure. The Iroquois spirit taught the world centuries ago what justice, equality, and collective decision-making meant. This great union is the most beautiful and ancient example of how humankind can abandon violence and come together around common sense.
Deep within your mind, travel to the very heart of the American continent, to the vast, undulating prairies stretching between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River. We are still between 1000 and 1400 AD, long before the world of the horsemen and warriors we know today. The landscape before you is wild, pristine, and silent, beyond the imagination of modern man. The only sounds across this endless plain are the fierce wind blowing through the knee-high grass and the distant, earth-shattering rumble of thunder. But this is not a storm. It is an ancient symphony rising from the hooves of millions of American bison or buffalo. At this time, life for the Plains tribes was shaped by the rhythm of these colossal creatures. In an era before the horse had set foot on the continent, people traversed these endless distances on foot, carrying all their belongings on simple sleds called travois, 2 long sticks pulled by dogs. Yes, the dog's loyalty was the greatest aid to these peoples before the horse's might. For the Plains Indians, the buffalo was not just a game animal, but a sacred gateway of sustenance sent from heaven to earth, a living library, and the source of everything. Planning a hunt would take weeks. In the absence of horses, overcoming these enormous and ferocious animals required immense intelligence and patience. The strategy called buffalo jump was one of the most dramatic displays of human ingenuity over nature. Hunters would slowly channel the herd in a specific direction without startling them, young men donning wolf skins and manipulating the herd's leaders toward the cliff edges. That terrifying run, beginning at the last second, would end with the herd falling in panic down the cliff. This was not a massacre, but a sacred gift that would allow a tribe to survive the winter. Prayers were offered for each animal that fell, and apologies were made to its spirit. No part of the animal was wasted. Their meat was food, their hides the covering of those iconic tents we call teepee, their bones needles and knives, their horns spoons, and even their bladders water containers. Teepee tents were the most elegant engineering marvels of this nomadic life. Made of a few tree poles and buffalo hide, these structures could be disassembled and reassembled in minutes, providing excellent aerodynamics against the harshest winter winds and staying cool in the summer by allowing air circulation from their bases. The spiritual world of these people was as boundless as the plains they inhabited. The enormous circular structures drawn on the ground with stones, called medicine wheels, represented both the cycle of the universe and the positions of the stars. For them, time was not linear, but circular. Sun dances and vision quests were the most intimate moments when a young person stepping into adulthood connected with nature and their ancestors. When night fell and the stars shone in that boundless blackness, the tribal elders gathered around the fire and whispered tales about how the universe was woven by a spider or why the wind sometimes cried.
This world, yet untouched by iron, gunpowder, or foreign diseases, possessed a tremendous balance within itself. Wars existed, of course, but even these wars were a game of honor. A counting coup was considered far greater heroism than killing the enemy, for life was sacred, and in the face of nature's harshness, human life was the most precious treasure. The gentle tremor felt beneath your feet was like the beating of millions of buffalo hearts underground.
This was the Quiet Plains era before the arrival of the horse, that fairy tale period when man was one with the earth, the animal, and the spirit, when time was measured only by the colors of the seasons. Now imagine the wind passing through the tall grass, hear the gentle bark of a dog and the deep growl of the distant herd of buffalo. This is your home. This is where eternity begins. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in the depths of the vast, untouched forests of present-day northeastern America, untouched by any European settler. It's an era where sunlight filters through the intertwined leaves of massive oak, maple, and birch trees, falling to the ground like golden drops. This is the ancient land of the woodland peoples who lived in harmony with every breath of nature. For them, the forest was not just a shelter, it was a market, a pharmacy, a temple, and, most importantly, a teacher. Here, life was measured by the flow of rivers and the changing colors of the seasons. Here, the rustling of the soft, damp leaves beneath your feet, the accumulation of millennia.
The land was so fertile that life burst forth from every inch of the forest. The architectural genius of the woodland peoples lay in imitating nature. Their iconic dome-shaped houses, called wigwam, were built directly from the forest itself. Flexible saplings were planted in the ground, their ends joined to form a frame and covered with birch bark or woven mats. Stepping inside a wigwam, the sound of the freezing wind outside ceased, and the peaceful warmth of the small fire in the center, along with the scent of smoked meat, enveloped you. These homes were not merely shelters, but sacred spaces where family ties were tightly bound together like ears of corn. When winter arrived and the snow reached knee-deep, the stories told in these small refuges kept the tribe's memory alive. But these people were not entirely settled. The forest whispered to them a seasonal rhythm of migration. In spring, they descended to the riverbanks, gliding across the streams in feather-light canoes made of birch bark. These canoes were marvels of engineering, light enough for a single man to carry, yet strong enough to carry a family and winter provisions. The social fabric of these people was woven into the belts made of purple and white seashells, which we now call wampum.
For them, the wampum was not simply jewelry or currency, but a sacred archive, each piece a promise, an agreement, a record of history. An envoy carrying a tribe's message to another would hold a wampum belt, the patterns on which indicated whether peace or war was coming. Woodland peoples maintained a magnificent balance between agriculture and hunting. While the Three Sisters fields flourished in clearings in the forest, men tracked deer, bears, and beavers. They respected the spirit of every animal they hunted, wasting no part, from bone to hide. A deer was not just meat, it was a soft pair of moccasins to wear in winter, a needle to sew with, and twine to hold the tent together. Their spiritual world was based on a truly animist philosophy. According to them, not only people, but every tree, every rock, every wind had a spirit. The hooting of an owl echoing in the depths of the forest could be a warning from a deceased ancestor. A sudden, strong gust of wind was perceived as a message from Manitou, the Great Spirit. This deep reverence ensured the forest's sustainability for millennia. They never took more than they needed, never exhausted the soil. Trade routes were like the veins of the continent. Copper from the Ohio Valley met shells from the seashore along these forest paths. Thousands of miles of these paths would form the basis of many of the modern highways we use today. Now imagine that purple mist descending upon the forest one afternoon. A rhythmic drumbeat echoes from afar, like the pulse of the earth.
Women are returning to the village with baskets full of fruit. Men are pulling their canoes ashore from the cool waters of the river. The smell of gunpowder hasn't yet been felt. The coldness of steel hasn't yet been experienced. Only the ancient song of nature remains.
This was the golden age of the woodland peoples, that peaceful period when the trees whispered, the waters spoke, and man was merely a voice in that chorus. When the first star appears in the sky, the forest dwellers fall into a deep sleep in the embrace of this vast green womb, ready to awaken to a new day. Now imagine yourself on the rugged shores of the Pacific, battered by the smoky, gray, and massive waves. This is the northwest coast, stretching from present-day Washington state into the interior of Alaska, home to one of the world's richest and most complex hunter-gatherer civilizations. The air is always humid, the soil always wet. The scent of the enormous red cedar trees, combined with the salty ocean breeze, stings your nostrils. Here, unlike other tribes, life was not based on agriculture, but on the incredible, inexhaustible abundance offered by the sea and the forest. For these peoples, nature was not a mother, but a generous emperor. The millions of salmon that flowed upstream each year were the lifeblood of this civilization. When the salmon arrived, the rivers turned silver, and thanks to this abundance, the Northwest peoples managed to live a settled and extremely luxurious life without needing to farm. This wealth brought with it an unparalleled understanding of art and social hierarchy.
Now imagine yourself on the rugged shores of the Pacific, battered by the smoky, gray, and massive waves. This is the Northwest coast, stretching from present-day Washington into the interior of Alaska, home to one of the world's richest and most complex hunter-gatherer civilizations. The air is always humid, the soil always wet. The scent of the enormous red cedar trees, combined with the salty ocean breeze, stings your nostrils. Here, unlike other tribes, life was not based on agriculture, but on the incredible, inexhaustible abundance offered by the sea and the forest. For these peoples, nature was not a mother, but a generous emperor. The millions of salmon that flowed upstream each year were the lifeblood of this civilization. When the salmon arrived, the rivers turned silver, and thanks to this abundance, the Northwest peoples managed to live a settled and extremely luxurious life without needing to farm. This wealth brought with it an unparalleled understanding of art and social hierarchy. Imagine, lined along the coast were massive houses made of enormous cedar logs, painted and carved, called plank houses. In front of these houses rose the famous totem poles, meters high, defying the sky. Totems were not idols to be worshipped, as is often thought. They were the gigantic identity cards, family tree, and historical archives of that house, that clan. Looking at a totem pole, you could read which mythical animal the family was related to, which battles they had won, and what spiritual powers they possessed. The cunning of the raven, the strength of the killer whale, and the vision of the eagle came to life again in each hollow of these poles. For them, art was not just ornamentation, but the highest expression of existence. Every spoon, every canoe, every mask was adorned with intricate geometric patterns and animal figures that seemed about to come to life.
But the heart of this culture beat in the massive and earth-shattering ceremonies called potlatch. Potlatch was a massive feast and distribution ceremony held to demonstrate a chief's power. In stark contrast to the modern world's obsession with accumulation, prestige among these peoples was measured not by how much you possessed, but by how much you could give away to others. A chief would sometimes distribute all the wealth accumulated over years, hundreds of blankets, carved copper plates, dried fish, and priceless works of art to his guests in a single night. Sometimes, to prove his wealth, he would even burn or throw his most valuable possessions into the sea in front of everyone.
This was the most radical way of saying, "I am so powerful that the absence of this wealth does not shake me." The moving masks worn during potlatch ceremonies, the shamans dancing in the firelight, and the rhythmic drumming transported one from the physical world to the world of spirits and myths. The social structure of these peoples was clearly divided into nobles, commoners, and slaves. These warrior traders, sailing the sea in their enormous canoes carved from cedar wood, had established trade networks stretching for thousands of kilometers along the coast. A single canoe could carry 50 warriors and be flexible enough to withstand the ferocity of the ocean. For them, the sea was not an obstacle, but a highway. The women wove waterproof hats and cloaks from cedar bark and enriched their tables with fruits gathered from the depths of the forest. Their spiritual beliefs were based on mysterious creatures living in the depths of the sea and giant spirits in the darkness of the forest. Their faith in the sea people was so strong that before each hunt they offered gifts to the sea, returning the first bone of a salmon to the water in a sacred ceremony. Thus, they believed the fish's spirit would return. Now imagine that dense white mist settling on the shore. The eyes of the totems seem to be looking at you from within that mist. In the distance, the sound of a killer whale spouting water is heard, and smoke rises from one of the village's enormous houses. Inside, potlatch has begun. The drums beat in rhythm with your heart. This is that misty coast where labor turned to art, wealth to generosity, that magnificent golden age when the peoples of the Northwest transformed the bounty of nature into an aesthetic feast. Can you hear those powerful, proud voices echoing in the shade of the cedar trees before the sails of foreign ships appeared on the horizon? They were the true masters of the ocean.
Open the doors of your mind and imagine yourself in the midst of an endless crimson. We're in those silent and dignified lands where the setting sun paints the sky blood red, purple, and gold, where gigantic cacti stand like sentinels. This is the heart of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, the Southwest deserts where human endurance is tested to its limits. Here, the air is so dry that your sweat evaporates before it even dries. But amidst this scorching heat and thirst, there are peoples who have lived for thousands of years not in war with nature, but in magnificent harmony. The Apaches, the Navajos, and the Hopis. Each has listened to a different voice of the desert. Each has found their own way of surviving in this sea of sand. First, imagine the Hopis. They are the people of peace. Thousands of years ago, they arrived here and built apartment-like villages called pueblo from mud and stone on the vast mesas, flat-topped mountains. For the Hopi, life revolves around the miracle of corn. In the arid desert soil, using only groundwater and rare rainfall, they cultivate colorful corn with a mastery called dry farming. A Hopi corn cob is not just food, it's a philosophy of life. The growth of corn is equated with the spiritual development of a person. The hymns rising from the underground chambers called kiva in the center of the village are letters sent to the sky to bring rain.
In their world, there are kachina spirits. Masked dancers represent these spirits, performing ceremonies and trying to maintain the balance of the universe. The Hopi are so deeply connected to the land that for them, moving is like uprooting themselves. Right next to them rises the Navajo people, who arrived in this region later but have embraced the spirit of the desert just as much as they have. The Navajo are masters of the desert's aesthetics. Their living spaces are sacred shelters called hogan, 6- or 8-sided structures whose doors always face east towards the rising sun.
The famous blankets that emerge from a Navajo woman's loom carry all the colors of the desert, the red of the earth, the blue of the sky, and the gray of the storm. But what truly makes them unique is the art of sand painting. During healing rituals, shamans draw incredibly complex patterns on the ground with colored sand. These patterns are not just paintings, but temporary temples created to heal spirits. When the ritual is over, that magnificent work of art is erased, because according to Navajo belief, nothing is permanent. What matters is the balance of the moment. And then come the Apache, who move like ghosts of the desert. They have chosen the freedom of movement over a settled life. Apache means resilience. It is said that an Apache warrior can run 80 kilometers a day under the scorching sun with only a piece of dried meat and a sip of water. For them, the desert is not an obstacle, but a perfect hiding place.
Their temporary shelters, called wickiups, made of bushes and branches, are almost invisible in nature. In the Apache's spiritual world, there are gan, or mountain spirits. When young men dance, wearing crowns and painting their bodies to represent these spirits, the silence of the desert is broken by this powerful rhythm. They did not believe in land ownership. For them, the world belonged to everyone, and moving freely on it was the greatest sanctity. The point where these three different cultures intersect is their deep respect for the desert. For them, water is worth its weight in gold. Every drop is greeted with a prayer. Every plant, every lizard, every jackal in the desert is a brother. At night, in the freezing cold that descends upon the desert, the elders gather around the small fires burning in the Hogan and Pueblo houses, whispering ancient creation myths that tell how they came to be from the first world. The Milky Way in the sky is, for them, a path walked by the spirits of their ancestors. In an era before the smell of gunpowder polluted the desert air, before fences divided the land, man and the desert were like one breath. Now, pause for a moment and imagine the sound of a flute echoing across those red rocks. The wind gently rustles the sand. The cry of an eagle can be heard in the distance. As the sun disappears over the horizon, the desert calms but never sleeps. The earth still carries the warmth of the day, and you feel that you are part of an ancient wisdom within this sacred silence. This is where resilience, art, and spirit converge. Welcome to the eternal and dignified spirit of the Southwest.
Now imagine stepping inside one of the famous longhouses of the Iroquois Haudenosaunee Confederation. The hierarchy within was unlike any political system we know today. The clan mothers were the highest authority in society. They not only governed the family, but also determined the political future of the tribe. The clan mothers decided on the selection of a chief, or sachem. If a chief did not treat his people fairly, made selfish decisions, or strayed from the path of peace, the clan mothers would issue 3 warnings and eventually strip him of his authority. Even the strongest warriors ultimately had to seek the approval of a wise woman. Women were also the ones who decided whether or not to declare war, because those who would go to war were their husbands, sons, and brothers. They knew best the cost of bloodshed. This was not a rule based on brute force, but a rule of wisdom based on the sanctity of life. In Cherokee society, there was a title called Beloved Woman. Women holding this title sat in the front row at assemblies and voted on decisions. They were like the spiritual glue that held the community together. They were the ones who planted and harvested the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, in the fields, and managed the granaries with meticulous precision to prevent famine in the winter. The economy was in the hands of women, which gave them immense freedom. A woman was never economically dependent on a man. On the contrary, the well-being of the community depended on her industriousness and organizational skills. This created not competition, but a perfect division of labor between men and women. While men engaged in hunting, trade, and diplomacy in the outside world, women ensured the internal structure, law, and continuity of the tribe. Violence and abuse were almost non-existent in these societies, because disrespect shown to a woman was considered disrespect shown to her entire clan, that is, to dozens of powerful sisters and aunts. Women were not only biological mothers, but also the memory and teachers of the tribe. They passed on to the children which plants cured which ailments, when each star would rise, and millennia-old oral traditions. The tone in their voices was the conscience of the tribe. In rituals and dances, it was believed that they communicated directly with Mother Earth through their bare feet touching the earth. For them, the land was not property, but a mother, and only another mother could adequately care for a mother. Now imagine those dignified women gathered around the evening fire, baskets in their hands, babies on their backs, the wisdom of millennia on their faces. With a single word from the lips of a clan mother, an entire tribe could relocate or sign a peace treaty. The white man had not yet come and confined women to their homes, silenced their voices. These women were the true architects of America. Their sense of justice, their compassion for nature, and their unwavering authority ensured that these civilizations survived intact for thousands of years. When the wind blows, the rustling sound coming from the corn leaves still carries the whispers of these wise women. They were both the owners and the soul of this land.
For Native Americans, spirit wasn't something only humans possessed. A stone, a flowing river, a strong wind, or a wolf swiftly scurrying through the forest all held spirits just as valuable as those of humans. For them, the universe was a sacred network bound together by a vast energy they called the Great Mystery, or Wakantanka. In this belief system, what was sacred wasn't somewhere in the sky, but right here, in the earth you trod upon, the bark of the trees you touched, and the morning mist you breathed in. The line between nature and humanity was so thin that a human could transform into an animal in a dream, and a tree could speak like a wise old man. Shamans, or healing people, were the bridge between these two worlds. Imagine, on a dark night, with only the crackling of a campfire, the rhythmic sound of a shaman's drums begins to rise. This drumming is not just music, it is the heartbeat of Mother Earth. As the shaman cleanses the area with sacred sage or cedar leaves, whose smoke rises to the sky, they embark on a journey into the spirit world. On this journey, they see the world through the eyes of eagles and heal the sick with the power of bears. For them, illness was not merely a physical ailment, but a disruption of the soul's balance with nature. To heal meant to realign with the universe's immense circular rhythm. Every feather, every dye, and every movement used in the rituals had a cosmic meaning. The paints they applied to their faces were not just adornments, but a mask of the spiritual identity they assumed at that moment. One of the most profound spiritual experiences of the indigenous peoples was the vision quest. A young man or woman, transitioning from childhood to adulthood, would go alone to the top of a desolate mountain or into a deep forest. For days, without food or water, listening only to nature, they would wait for their protective spirit, their totem. The soaring of an eagle, the howling of a jackal, or the unique sound of the wind rustling through tree branches would become a spiritual guide for that person, a guide they would carry throughout their life. It was an individual's quest to find their place in the universe. They never asked, "Who am I?" They asked, "Where do I stand within this whole?" Because a person alone was as weak as a leaf blown by the storm, but united with the whole, they could become the storm itself. Ceremonies, on the other hand, were a space for communal purification.
Consider the magnificent sun dance of the Plains tribes, that colossal ceremony lasting for days, where drums never cease and people transcend their physical pain to dedicate themselves to the well-being of the community and the revitalization of nature. Or the green corn ceremony of the southeastern Anatolian peoples. When harvest time arrived, all past grievances were forgotten, old fires were extinguished, and a brand new sacred fire was lit in the center of the tribe. This was a reset, a rebirth of the soul and the community. For them, time was not a linear path, but an unending, sacred circle. Seasons changed, the moon waxed and waned, people died and turned to dust, but that great circle of life was never broken.
Respect for animal spirits was the noblest aspect of this belief. A hunter would kneel beside the deer he had shot, honor its last breath, and thank it for offering its life to the tribe. This was not a murder, but an exchange of life. If you did not show respect to the animal, it was believed that its spirit would return and never hunt again. This was not fear, but discipline born of deep love. For them, ethics was not in written laws, but in that subtle pang felt when plucking a leaf from a tree. Now, for a moment, imagine a smoking peace pipe, calumet, being passed from hand to hand under a star-filled sky. The smoke from the pipe carries prayers to the Great Spirit. In each breath, the wisdom of the past and the hope of the future merge. The silence is so profound you can hear the whispers of ancestors sleeping beneath the earth. This is the homeland of the soul, the sacred place where humanity is married to nature. No foreign faith has yet disturbed this silence. No book has yet imprisoned this living spirit within its pages. There is only life, only spirit, and only eternal gratitude. As the sun slowly rose behind the palm trees, a typical, peaceful day began for the Taino people, the inhabitants of the island. For the Taino, the sea was a friend, and the land an inexhaustible source of generosity. They glided among the coral reefs in their canoes, wove cotton, and enjoyed this paradise island they called Haiti. But that morning, on the horizon, floats with enormous wings, unlike anything they had ever seen before, appeared. These three ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, carried not only wood and sails, but the end of one world and the dark birth of another. When Christopher Columbus and his men landed, the two worlds didn't just collide, they collapsed into one another.
When the Taino saw these strangely dressed men, their faces covered in hair and wearing gleaming metal armor, they thought they were gods or spirits from the sky. Taino culture was built on hospitality. According to their beliefs, not offering hospitality to a stranger would disrupt the balance of the universe. They offered everything they had. With great innocence, they offered these foreigners small gold ornaments, parrots, fresh fruit, and balls of cotton. Imagine those famous lines Columbus wrote in his logbook. They are so docile and peaceful that they carry no weapons. I showed them a sword, and in their ignorance they grasped the sharp edge and cut their hands. This simple sentence was, in fact, the first harbinger of the tragedy to come. On one side, an innocence that considered sharing sacred, and on the other, an ambition that placed conquest and possession above all else. Mutual misunderstandings were weaving the greatest tragedy in history. While the Taino people thought these men were weary souls and tried to give them rest, the Spaniards' eyes were only on the small gold pieces the natives wore in their noses and ears. For Columbus, these people were souls to be saved or subjects to be subdued, but never equal individuals. Think of that famous moment of encounter. On one side, a native chief, barefoot on the earth, seemingly one with nature. On the other, an admiral, his heavy boots buried in the sand, holding a cross and sword.
There was no language, only signs. And those signs, sadly, asked for much more than peace. They asked where the gold was.
Columbus, believing this to be India, called them Indios, Indians. Although born from a geographical error, this name became a misleading label that would lump all the peoples of a continent together for thousands of years. The first few days were filled with mutual curiosity and trade. Glass beads were exchanged for priceless gifts offered by the Taino people. But as the Spaniards' stay on the island lengthened, that image of paradise quickly transformed into a hell. From day one, Columbus had this plan in mind. They have no weapons. With 50 men, we can subdue them all and make them do whatever we want. This mindset was the cornerstone of colonialism. The Taino people, these smiling people who had lived freely on their own land for centuries, did not yet know that they would soon be transformed into slaves on their own island. That evening, as the sun set, the shadows of the ships fell like long, dark hands on the sands. The rhythmic drum beats from the depths of the forest echoed, perhaps for the last time so peacefully. While the Taino people discussed these strange guests around the fire, the men on the ships dreamed of gold and cleaned their rifles.
This was not just an exploration, but the beginning of the greatest cultural and biological rupture human history had ever seen. Two worlds had merged, but this merging would not be an embrace, but an act of swallowing. On that warm October night of 1492, as the wind blew through the palm trees, the end of the old world and the bloody dawn of the modern world silently awaited. Now for a moment, imagine yourself standing on that beach, feeling the warm sand beneath your feet and the smell of the ocean in your nose. Those 3 ships on the horizon were not just piles of wood. They were Trojan horses carrying diseases, steel, gunpowder, and a completely different understanding of ownership. The sincere smile of the Taino people was about to be shrouded in a sorrow that would never again appear the same in the dusty pages of history. The first contact had been made, and nothing would ever be the same again. Not the land, not the rivers, not the spirits. The greatest tragedies in human history are often recounted on battlefields amidst the clash of swords and the fumes of gunpowder. But the true fate of the American continent was decided not by steel or lead, but by a microscopic world. European ships carried not only soldiers, priests, and gold prospectors. In the holds of those ships, in the folds of their clothing, and in the breath of the sailors, lay an invisible army that the Native Americans had never encountered for millennia, an army whose immune systems were utterly defenseless. Smallpox, measles, influenza, whooping cough, and typhoid.
These diseases were not merely ailments for the natives, but harbingers of doom from the heavens. Close your eyes and imagine for a moment that you were in a Native American village of that era. The warriors are strong, the granaries are full, the tribal order is perfect. But one day, after a brief exchange with a stranger from a distant shore, the village elder suddenly falls ill with a fever. Then the children, then the mothers. This is unlike any disease the tribe had ever seen before. Traditional healers' herbs, sacred songs, and sweat lodges proved helpless against this enemy. Even sweat lodges, the natives' most sacred ritual, made the situation worse by immersing feverish patients in icy waters, accelerating deaths from pneumonia and shock. It was such a devastation that sometimes half the population of an entire village would perish in a single week. Smallpox was the commander-in-chief of this army. With its terrible sores and high fever, it not only destroyed the body, but also the morale of the community. Native beliefs held that diseases stemmed from spiritual imbalance. However, these new diseases killed so quickly and indiscriminately that people began to think their gods had abandoned them. Most painfully, Europeans had developed immunity to these diseases for centuries. When the natives saw that the white man was not dying, but they themselves were being wiped out en masse, they fell into deep despair, believing it to be divine punishment or witchcraft. This psychological collapse was the biggest factor in breaking the will to resist and making the colonizers' job easier. The numbers were terrifying. Historians estimate that in the first 150 years after Columbus's arrival, approximately 90% of the Native American population was wiped out by these epidemics.
This meant the silent erasure of tens of millions of people, thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, languages, and stories. Diseases often traveled even faster than Europeans. Before the white man even reached the Mississippi River, the microbes he carried had crossed forest paths, reached inland tribes via trade routes, and turned these places into ghost towns. When an explorer first set foot in a region, instead of a magnificent civilization, he found abandoned mounds and villages filled with skeletons. This laid the groundwork for the cruel and arrogant delusion of Europeans that this is an empty land, God cleared it for us to settle. This biological catastrophe also destroyed the social structure. Clan mothers, wise elders, and tribal leaders were among the first to die. Along with them, thousands of years of oral history, traditions, and rituals were buried. The memory of society was being erased. Fields could not be cultivated, hunting could not be done, and the handful of survivors could not even find the strength to bury their dead. The real force behind the weakening of those magnificent mound cities and jungle confederations on the Mississippi River was not gunpowder, but this microscopic invasion. Now imagine those silent forests, the smokeless wigwams, and the abandoned canoes along the riverbank. The wind no longer carries the sound of singing people, but the desolation of deserted villages. This was not just a loss of population, it was the forced alteration of a continent's genetics, culture, and soul. The invisible enemy had so weakened the true owners of America that the steel swords and rifles we will see in later chapters would be the final blows to an already kneeling giant. The winds that blew after 1492 carried not only pollen, but also the silent and invisible seeds of death.
Imagine yourself on a damp, foggy morning in 1607 on the Virginia coast. In the shallow waters of the Chesapeake Bay, 3 English ships approach the shore, watched by thousands of eyes from the depths of the forest. These eyes belonged to the Powhatan Confederacy. Powhatan was a powerful and strategic leader, uniting over 30 tribes under one banner. When the English established their first permanent settlement in the middle of the swamps, which they called Jamestown, they were merely pitiful strangers to the natives. The English knew neither how to hunt nor how to cope with the harsh nature of this new world. Had it not been for the natives' corn aid, Jamestown would have remained a failed attempt in the dusty pages of history, nearing the point of cannibalism during their first winter. And it is at this point that the little girl at the center of the legends appears, Amonute, or as she is better known, Pocahontas. Contrary to fairy tales, Pocahontas was only a child of 10 to 12 years old at the time, and there was no romantic relationship between her and the English captain John Smith. The story, written years later by John Smith, that Pocahontas placed her head on mine to save me from her father's execution, is considered by most historians to either be a fabrication or merely an adoption and commitment ritual that Smith did not understand.
As the daughter of the tribal leader, Pocahontas was an ambassador between two worlds, an object of curiosity and a strategic pawn of her father. She was a brave child who brought food to the English settlement and maintained the fragile peace between the two peoples. However, peace did not last long. The English's insatiable greed for land and their desire to view the natives as savages fueled conflict. By 1613, the English had captured Pocahontas as a prisoner of war. Their aim was to corner her father, Powhatan, and recover the stolen weapons and captured Englishmen. Pocahontas was held captive for a year. During this time, she was taught English, Christianized, and baptized with the name Rebecca. Torn from her people, her roots, and her spiritual world, this young girl was being transformed into a propaganda tool. During her captivity, she met and married the tobacco merchant John Rolfe. This marriage, although known in history as the Peace of Pocahontas, was in reality the first major symbol of a people's assimilation and submission. In 1616, Pocahontas was taken to London to be exhibited as a success story. Imagine that young woman, raised in the free forests of Virginia, was now presented to the English aristocracy as a tamed savage amidst corsets, stone buildings, and sooty streets. She was the fruit of colonialism, proof that natives could be civilized. But this journey proved to be her end. The English air and the millennia-old foreign microbes it carried took their toll on Pocahontas's weakened body. In 1617, at the age of just 21, she perished on a ship in Gravesend before she could return home. With Pocahontas's death, the delicate balance in Virginia was completely shattered. As the English expanded tobacco cultivation, they seized the Powhatan people's hunting grounds one by one.
For the natives, the land was a sacred thing to live on. For the English, it was merely a commodity to be sold. In 1622, the Powhatans launched a final resistance, attacking Jamestown, but this attack provided the English with the legitimate pretext they sought to completely annihilate or expel the natives. Forests were burned, villages plundered, and the once powerful Confederation slowly began to fade from the historical scene. The true story of Pocahontas is not a love story. It is a tragic account of cultural usurpation, forced change, and the deep chasm between two worlds. She was neither a princess nor a hero who saved the white man. She was a tragic victim caught between two brutal worlds, forced to sacrifice her own identity. Today, when the fog settles over the rivers of Virginia, you can see reflections of a kidnapped girl, burned villages, and the cold face of colonialism. Jamestown may be the birthplace of the British Empire in America, but it was also the first major scene of the usurpation of indigenous honor and land.
In modern American culture, Thanksgiving is often depicted as a fairy tale gathering of devout Christians holding hands and smiling Native Americans bringing them corn. But the voice of truth echoes beneath the rustling of those orange leaves in a far more complex and strategic tone. The true hero of this story is Massasoit, the sachem of the Wampanoag people. On that day, Massasoit sat at the table not merely to share food, but to secure the future of his people. For the Wampanoag, 1621 was not a year of celebration, but a time of mourning and regrouping. Just before the English pilgrims landed on the Mayflower in 1620, a terrible epidemic, likely smallpox or plague, had wiped out approximately 90% of the Wampanoag population. The shores were filled with ghost villages, with no one left to bury their dead. Massasoit knew his once powerful nation was weakening and vulnerable to attacks from their western enemies, the Narragansett tribe. That is why he saw the hungry and desperate English strangers settling on the Plymouth coast not as friends, but as military allies who could be used against the Narragansetts. Imagine that famous feast. The natives weren't savages admiring the English eating with forks. Rather, Massasoit and his 90 armed warriors had come to investigate whether the colonists were preparing for war, having heard them firing into the air during a harvest celebration.
When they realized it was a celebration, they joined the feast as a diplomatic gesture, bringing 5 deer with them. This 3-day gathering was less a fraternal meal and more a tense diplomatic summit confirming the mutual dependence of two fragile groups.
The Wampanoags taught the English how to survive on this land, how to cultivate corn, and how to use fish dung. Because the survival of the English meant the survival of the Wampanoags' defense line against the Narragansetts. But the price of this alliance would be very high. From the English perspective, gratitude was an expression of thankfulness to God for granting them these empty lands, actually villages emptied by plague. The natives, however, always celebrated the harvest by giving thanks to nature. This was nothing new for them. This mutual cultural divide deepened over the years. The English began to transform from allies to masters. Their land claims never ceased. For the Wampanoag, land was a sacred thing to live on and share. But for the English, every inch of land was private property to be fenced off. As the fences rose, the natives' hunting grounds shrank, and their millennia-old way of life was shackled. Massasoit spent his life trying to preserve this forced peace. But when he died and his son Massasoit, or King Philip as the English called him, succeeded him, the false smiles of that first meal would be replaced by a bloody reckoning. Today, for the descendants of Wampanoag, this date is not a celebration, but a national day of mourning. For them, this feast is the starting point of the loss of their land,
the assimilation of their culture, and a great betrayal. The cornbread and venison on the table were, in fact, the seal of the first signature on the tragic end of a people. Now imagine that autumn evening. The fires are dying down, the warriors are returning to the forest, and the English are saying their prayers. An owl's hoot from the depths of the forest seems to whisper of the coming storm. Every morsel shared at that first meal was, in fact, a piece torn from the ancient soul of the American continent. Peace was merely the unsettling silence before the approaching storm. The Wampanoag perspective reminds us not only that history is written by the victors, but also the searing truth hidden in the silence of the vanquished. Go back to the damp and tense summer of 675. In the lands where Massasoit and the Pilgrims once shared venison, only the smell of gunpowder and the cold breath of treachery could be felt. 50 years of fragile peace had been shattered by the English's insatiable greed for land, their forced conversion of the natives to Christianity, and the plundering of their cornfields by their cattle. Massasoit's son, Metacom, or King Philip, as the English mockingly called him, unlike his father, understood that the white man's intention was not to share, but to utterly destroy. For Metacom, this was not a choice, but a life-or-death struggle. They would either fight with honor or slowly perish. The war erupted with the killing of a Wampanoag interpreter and the subsequent execution of 3 natives by the English. But this was only a spark. The powder keg was already full. Metacom, through immense diplomatic success, managed to unite warring tribes, Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Nipmuc, under a single banner. Imagine those quiet forests turned into hell overnight. Native warriors raided British settlements, set houses ablaze, and drove colonists from their seemingly impregnable forts. In the first months of the war, Metacom was so successful that the British were terrified of the strategic genius of these savages. Of the 90 British towns in the region, 52 were attacked and 12 were completely wiped off the map. However, this war was the bloodiest conflict in American history in proportion to population. To crush the native resistance, the British used not only their soldiers, but also the brutal method known as total war. In the middle of winter, they raided defenseless Narragansett villages, burning women, children, and the elderly alive in their shelters. That night, known as the Great Swamp Fight, the blood flowing across the snow was the heaviest blow to the heart of the indigenous resistance.
Metacom's people were struggling with hunger, disease, and the ever-increasing English reinforcements. Disintegration began among the indigenous allies. Some tribes defected to the English side to survive. Towards the end of the war, Metacom was hunted like prey in the lands he once ruled. In August 1676, in a swamp on Rhode Island, he was shot and killed by one of his own people. But his death was not enough for the English. Metacom's body was dismembered, his head severed, and displayed on a stake at the entrance to Plymouth for 20 years.
The children of the people whose corn his fathers had once fed now passed by, gazing into the empty eye sockets of his skull. This was the physical, as well as the symbolic, annihilation of the indigenous presence in New England. The toll of this war was horrific. Almost 40% of the indigenous population was wiped out. Most of the survivors were sold into slavery on sugarcane plantations in the West Indies. They had neither a homeland nor a future. With this victory, the English declared their divine right to the American continent. For them, this wilderness was now entirely theirs, and the natives were merely obstacles to be cleared. King Philip's War was the first major turning point in Native American resistance in North America. After this date, it would become impossible to speak of an independent Native American power in New England. Now imagine those desolate swamps and ash-covered forests. The wind carries the soot of burned villages and the cries of those exiled. Metacom's resistance, though it may seem like a defeat, was actually the cry of a spirit that refused to surrender. That head on the stake was not a hatred of the white man, but the final gasp of a lost world, a stolen honor, and that sacred bond with the land. When silence fell over New England in the autumn of 1676, it was not a sign of peace, but of the end of an era.
Imagine the vast expanse of the Great Plains where the sun dances on the yellow grass. For millennia, the people who lived on these lands meant distance, weary feet, and heavy sleds pulled by dogs. But in the late 17th century, after the Pueblo Revolt in the Southwest, the Spanish horses, freed from their constraints, began to spread northward like a wild wind. For the indigenous peoples, this creature was initially a terrifying beast, but they soon understood it to be a sacred dog, sky dog. The arrival of the horse had a far greater impact on indigenous culture than the invention of the wheel, almost like an industrial revolution. The silence of the plains was now broken by the symphony of thousands of hooves. With the arrival of the horse, the world of the indigenous peoples expanded. Tribes that could only follow buffalo herds a few kilometers away could now cover tens of kilometers in a single day. The horse became not only a means of transport, but also the greatest symbol of status, wealth, and freedom. The number of horses a warrior owned was the most important criterion determining his place in society. Tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Blackfoot began to move like centaurs on horseback. So much so that a Comanche warrior could hang his body beside his horse at full speed, shielding himself from enemy arrows while simultaneously firing his own.
The horse became not just their legs, but a part of their soul. Buffalo hunting underwent a complete transformation during this period. The perilous cliff-jumping strategies that used to last for weeks were replaced by thrilling and dynamic chases on horseback. Imagine young hunters plunging into the dust storms created by thousands of buffaloes with only a bow and arrow. The speed and agility of the horse greatly increased the access of indigenous peoples to protein and raw materials. This abundance led to the growth of teepee tents because horses could now carry heavier poles and hides, the development of crafts, and population growth. Thanks to the horse, the Great Plains Empire was born.
Tribes were no longer seasonal nomads, but true nomadic empires constantly on the move, following herds of buffalo. However, the horse brought not only abundance, but also an endless cycle of war. Horse theft became the most prestigious way for a tribe to gain honor. Sneaking into a rival tribe's camp at midnight and stealing the best stallion was considered a greater act of heroism than killing an enemy on the battlefield. This initiated a new system of chivalry based on horse culture in the plains. Wars were no longer fought for land, but for herds of horses and owner. This dynamism transformed the Plains tribes into the strongest and most resilient military force in the Americas. Indeed, when the U.S. Army later encountered these tribes, they would face the world's best light cavalry. In the spiritual world, too, the horse held a unique place. Special songs were composed for horses, their manes adorned with sacred feathers, and the horses of great fallen warriors were sacrificed to accompany their owners in the afterlife. The breath of a horse was seen as a representation of life energy in healing ceremonies.
Indigenous peoples believed the horse was a gift bestowed upon them by the Great Spirit. For thanks to this animal, the sky was closer, the horizon more attainable. The horse was a sacred key that released the imprisoned yearning for freedom within man. Now imagine the setting sun descending upon the plains, thousands of horses grazing peacefully in the pastures. In the distance, the sound of a young man neighing his horse comes. The wind whistles through the manes. This is the golden age of America's true Wild West, written by its true owners long before the white man's cowboy stories. A people on horseback charted their own destiny with the speed of the wind. Before railroads divided the plains, before rifles slaughtered herds of buffalo, this trinity of alliance between horse, land, and people created one of the noblest and freest ways of life history has ever seen. With every strike of the horse's hooves against the earth, the heart of a nation beat in rhythm. The French were allies who traded with and showed some respect to the indigenous peoples. However, when they lost the war and left, the British General Geoffrey Amherst, who replaced them, began treating the indigenous peoples as conquered subjects. The British cut off diplomatic gifts, a cornerstone of indigenous culture, banned the trade in ammunition, and began to settle recklessly on indigenous lands. This arrogance triggered one of the greatest and most organized indigenous resistances in American history.
Pontiac, the charismatic and visionary leader of the Ottawa tribe, entered the scene. Pontiac managed to unite not only his own tribe, but also dozens of different tribes, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Huron, Delaware, Shawnee, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi around a single common goal. His vision was not just a military offensive, but also a spiritual awakening. Inspired by the Delaware prophet Neolin's call to leave the white man's possessions and return to your own essence, Pontiac cast aside old tribal animosities and forged a massive confederacy against a common enemy. In the spring of 1763, with a battle cry echoing through the depths of the woods, 8 of the 12 English forts stretching along a 1,000-mile line were razed within weeks. The most iconic moment of this rebellion was the siege of Fort Detroit. Pontiac had planned to capture the fort in a surprise attack. However, a leak thwarted the plan, turning it into a prolonged Native American siege, a rare occurrence in history. Imagine, the English inside the fort knew that death lurked behind every tree in the forest outside. Pontiac commanded his warriors not merely as raiders, but as a disciplined army. As the forts fell one by one, English settlers began to flee eastward in panic to coastal cities. Pontiac had shattered the image of the English as invincible. However, the British response to this military genius was one of the darkest and most despicable methods in human history. With General Amherst's approval, British commanders at the besieged Fort Pitt gave blankets infected with smallpox to Native American representatives as a gift of peace.
This was one of the first examples of biological warfare in history. The invisible enemy infiltrated Pontiac's ranks. Armies began to crumble with disease, and logistics collapsed. At the same time, as it became clear that the French would no longer come to their aid, some tribes within the Confederation gradually began to seek peace. Pontiac was forced to sign a peace treaty in 1766, but he had actually gotten what he wanted. This rebellion so frightened King George III of England that he was forced to issue the Royal Proclamation of 1763. With this proclamation, all land west of the Appalachian Mountains was declared native territory, and white settlers were forbidden from crossing this boundary. Although Pontiac militarily reclaimed the forts, he politically established a border with the British Empire. Ironically, this border would ignite resentment among American settlers against Britain and pave the way for the American Revolution. Pontiac shook the balance between two great empires, demonstrating to the world what indigenous unity could achieve. Now imagine that misty Detroit River and those determined warriors in the forest. The fire of freedom in Pontiac's eyes was not just a defense of land, but a fight for the honor of a way of life. When he tragically met his end in 1769, he left behind not only burnt forts, but a vast legacy, proclaiming, "If we are united, we are unstoppable." Even today, the waves of the Great Lakes, when they crash against the shore, seem to whisper the voice of that great chief and his warriors, how they transformed the forests into fortresses for their freedom. The Pontiac Rebellion is one of the most glorious and darkest chapters in the history of a people refusing to kneel. This was one of the first examples of biological warfare in history. The invisible enemy infiltrated Pontiac's ranks. Armies began to crumble with disease, and logistics collapsed. At the same time, as it became clear that the French would no longer come to their aid, some tribes within the Confederation gradually began to seek peace. Pontiac was forced to sign a peace treaty in 1766, but he had actually gotten what he wanted. This rebellion so frightened King George III of England that he was forced to issue the Royal Proclamation of 1763. With this proclamation, all land west of the Appalachian Mountains was declared native territory, and white settlers were forbidden from crossing this boundary. Although Pontiac militarily reclaimed the forts, he politically established a border with the British Empire. Ironically, this border would ignite resentment among American settlers against Britain and pave the way for the American Revolution. Pontiac shook the balance between two great empires, demonstrating to the world what indigenous unity could achieve. Now imagine that misty Detroit River and those determined warriors in the forest. The fire of freedom in Pontiac's eyes was not just a defense of land, but a fight for the honor of a way of life. When he tragically met his end in 1769, he left behind not only burnt forts, but a vast legacy, proclaiming, "If we are united, we are unstoppable." Even today, the waves of the Great Lakes, when they crash against the shore, seem to whisper the voice of that great chief and his warriors, how they transformed the forests into fortresses for their freedom. The Pontiac Rebellion is one of the most glorious and darkest chapters in the history of a people refusing to kneel. Turn your gaze to the green hills and misty Appalachian Mountains of Georgia. Here, the Cherokee people had built a civilization that shattered the European stereotype of them as savages. They had their own constitution, their own courts, schools, and even a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in an alphabet invented by Sequoyah. They had learned the rules of the white man, practiced farming, and sought their rights within the framework of the law. But neither the law nor their remarkable conformity could stop the land-hungry, insatiable greed of white settlers and the gold reserves in Georgia. When President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, He was signing the death warrant of a nation. In that ominous spring of 1838, the American Army raided Cherokee villages. Imagine, people were dragged from their homes at bayonet point while eating dinner, working in the fields, or sleeping in their beds. They weren't even allowed to take a coat, a piece of food, or a sacred family heirloom. Torn from their millennia-old homeland and ancestral graves, they were imprisoned in filthy temporary shelters called concentration camps. Their homes, left behind, were plundered by white settlers before they even disappeared. This was the theft not only of a people's land, but also of their soul. The real tragedy began that winter. Approximately 16,000 Cherokee were forced on a march of thousands of miles toward what is now Oklahoma, the Indian lands.
This journey was called Nuna Daul Isunyi in the Cherokee language, meaning the way they wept. The winter was so harsh that the rivers froze. The people had no proper clothes or shoes. The army dragged them through the snow and mud like a caravan of prisoners. Every morning, the bodies of those who had frozen to death during the night were left by the roadside, and families too weak to dig the graves had to leave their loved ones in makeshift graves, sometimes just under the snow, and continue on their way. Diseases swept through them like executioners along the way. Dysentery, typhoid, and whooping cough claimed lives one by one, especially children and the elderly. Imagine a mother begging soldiers not to let her child, who froze to death in her arms, go, or an old man walking upright to protect the honor of his people, collapsing onto the snow when his legs could no longer support him. In total, more than 4,000 Cherokees perished on this road. That is, 1 in 4 people died without ever seeing their new homeland. This was not just a migration, it was a walking graveyard. The famous Cherokee Rose legend was born on this road. It is said that wherever a mother's tear fell, a white rose bloomed, representing their pain and purity. This exile was not just a physical devastation, it was also the murder of the Cherokees' faith in American justice. Even though the Supreme Court had ruled in their favor, President Jackson's disregard for the law, saying, "They made the decision, let them enforce it," proved that there was no longer any safe haven for indigenous peoples. When they reached the arid, alien plains of Oklahoma, the survivors were no longer the same people. The light in their eyes had faded, and the cold of that snowy road had settled in their hearts. Yet, despite this immense suffering, they did not perish. They rebuilt schools in their new lands, reassembled their assemblies, and persevered to keep their culture alive. Now imagine that endless snowy road, the laments echoing in the wind, and the countless nameless graves along its banks. The road of tears is the darkest shadow cast upon the brightest ideals of American history. This road is a monument to how cruel one nation can become and how resilient another can be. Today, when you meet a Cherokee in Oklahoma, you see in their eyes not only the present, but also the pain and honor of their ancestors who walked those snowy paths for thousands of miles. When the wind still blows along those old trails, it seems to carry the whispers of the spirits left behind. Tecumseh, he was not just a warrior, he was a philosopher. He had a vision to end millennia-old feuds between tribes and unite all indigenous nations from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico under a single Indian Confederacy. According to Tecumseh, the land belonged to no one who lived on it. It was the common heritage of all indigenous peoples, like the air and water, and not a single inch of land could be sold without the consent of any tribe. Tecumseh's colossal project also had a spiritual component. This journey was called Nuna Daul Isunyi in the Cherokee language, meaning the way they wept. The winter was so harsh that the rivers froze.
The people had no proper clothes or shoes. The army dragged them through the snow and mud like a caravan of prisoners. Every morning, the bodies of those who had frozen to death during the night were left by the roadside, and families too weak to dig the graves had to leave their loved ones in makeshift graves, sometimes just under the snow, and continue on their way. Diseases swept through them like executioners along the way. Dysentery, typhoid, and whooping cough claimed lives one by one, especially children and the elderly. Imagine a mother begging soldiers not to let her child, who froze to death in her arms, go, or an old man walking upright to protect the honor of his people, collapsing onto the snow when his legs could no longer support him. In total, more than 4,000 Cherokees perished on this road. That is, 1 in 4 people died without ever seeing their new homeland. This was not just a migration, it was a walking graveyard. The famous Cherokee Rose legend was born on this road. It is said that wherever a mother's tear fell, a white rose bloomed, representing their pain and purity. This exile was not just a physical devastation, it was also the murder of the Cherokees' faith in American justice.
Even though the Supreme Court had ruled in their favor, President Jackson's disregard for the law, saying, "They made the decision, let them enforce it," proved that there was no longer any safe haven for indigenous peoples. When they reached the arid, alien plains of Oklahoma, the survivors were no longer the same people. The light in their eyes had faded, and the cold of that snowy road had settled in their hearts. Yet, despite this immense suffering, they did not perish. They rebuilt schools in their new lands, reassembled their assemblies, and persevered to keep their culture alive. Now imagine that endless snowy road, the laments echoing in the wind, and the countless nameless graves along its banks. The road of tears is the darkest shadow cast upon the brightest ideals of American history. This road is a monument to how cruel one nation can become and how resilient another can be. Today, when you meet a Cherokee in Oklahoma, you see in their eyes not only the present, but also the pain and honor of their ancestors who walked those snowy paths for thousands of miles. When the wind still blows along those old trails, it seems to carry the whispers of the spirits left behind. Tecumseh, he was not just a warrior, he was a philosopher. He had a vision to end millennia-old feuds between tribes and unite all indigenous nations from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico under a single Indian Confederacy. According to Tecumseh, the land belonged to no one who lived on it. It was the common heritage of all indigenous peoples, like the air and water, and not a single inch of land could be sold without the consent of any tribe. Tecumseh's colossal project also had a spiritual component. His brother, Tenskwatawa, meaning prophet, preached to the indigenous peoples to renounce the white man's alcohol, textiles, and religion, and return to their roots. These two brothers founded a center called Prophetstown, located within present-day Indiana. This was the sacred capital of resistance. Tecumseh traveled thousands of miles on horseback over the years. One day he was at the Seminole Camp in Florida. The next month he was at the fires of the Lakota in the north. Everywhere he went, he whispered the same message with his immense oratorical power. A single stick is easily broken, but a bundle of sticks cannot be bent. The white man is hunting us down one by one, but if we unite, we can stop this flood. His greatest rival was General William Henry Harrison, who would later become President of the United States. Harrison held Tecumseh in deep respect, even fear. He described him as one of the greatest geniuses this continent has ever produced.
In 1811, while Tecumseh was on his way to persuade the southern tribes, Harrison realized he could not allow this unity to grow any further and attacked Prophetstown. In this conflict, known as the Battle of Tippecanoe, the sacred city that Tecumseh had founded was razed to the ground. When Tecumseh returned, he found his dream, which he had striven for years, reduced to smoke, but he did not give up. This attack pushed him to form an alliance with the British and to make his last great defense against American expansionism in the War of 1812. Tecumseh's stance on the battlefield was legendary.